I'm very, very disappointed by what happened, or I guess I'm more disappointed by what didn't happen in this meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. I mean, the situation now, people who in the United States wanted to say that Kim Jong-un bamboozled Trump in their first meeting in Singapore, and that Trump came away with nothing. The reality is, compared to a year ago, the world is in a much better place now in terms of the Korean Peninsula than it was a year ago this time. The head of the Council on Foreign Relations in late 2017 was saying that there was a 50-50 chance that there was going to be war on the Korean Peninsula. The heads of American intelligence and the former heads were saying they thought it was a 25% chance. That was terrifying. So now at least we're talking. The danger is, with the failure of this summit, that they didn't get anything. I'm just really saddened by that. There should have been some intermediate steps that they could have achieved, rather than going after these maximalist demands. We only know a little bit so far about what happened. We only know what Donald Trump has said happened. And Donald Trump says that the North Koreans demanded the complete end of U.S. sanctions in exchange for shutting down the Yongbyon nuclear facility. But there were a lot of intermediate steps. One of the big issues on the table was a peace declaration and then the development of a formal peace treaty. The Korean War went from 1950 to 1953. It ended a long time ago with an armistice. It's time now for a peace treaty. So that could have been achieved without everything else. There could have been concessions allowing or encouraging further economic relations between North Korea and South Korea. Moon Jae-in and the North Koreans very much wanted that. They came away with nothing in that way. So there could have been a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for a declaration of peace, in exchange for broader economic developments, and in exchange for a continued pledge not to test either the missiles or the bombs. My fear is what happens if North Korea does test again. What I think we need to be doing is bringing in other countries. This shouldn't be between Trump and Kim. We need the South Koreans at the table. We need the Chinese at the table. We need the Russians at the table. The same way we were able to achieve a great agreement with Iran, we could achieve a similar agreement with the Koreans. Nobody's saying this is easy. But if you go back to the 1994 agreement, that actually did work. And for 8 years, they managed to stop the North Korean processing of and development of plutonium. So there was a freeze of plutonium for 8 years. That's terrific. Right now, that's off the table again. The North Koreans are still producing more plutonium. They're still going on with their nuclear programs. They could be making more bombs. They have no commitment to not make more bombs. So we've assessed that they have somewhere between 20 and 65. That's a lot of nuclear weapons that they've got. And they don't even need nuclear weapons in order to threaten South Korea. The border is 35 miles from Seoul, a city of 25 million people. The United States has 28,500 troops there, but there are 200 American civilians in South Korea. They had their current nuclear capabilities can probably hit the continental United States, but they almost certainly can hit Japan, Guam, Okinawa. So it's still a very dangerous situation there, and with two unstable leaders. The person who does deserve, that Donald Trump got nominated for the Nuclear Peace Prize, and he urged Prime Minister Abe of Japan to nominate him, and Abe apparently has gone ahead and done so. And that's a joke, right? The whole world can laugh at that. But the person who might deserve the Nobel Peace Prize in this situation is Moon Jae-in. It was Moon Jae-in who took the initiative that brought North and South Korea together, that finally opened up the door to the United States meeting with the North Koreans. Trump had told Moon Jae-in he's wasting his time trying to talk to the North Koreans, but he persisted. And he had the backing of the South Korean people. You have to remember that Moon Jae-in is a product of the candlelight revolution that occurred in South Korea. The people were out in the streets for months, and they finally overthrew Park Geun-hye and her corrupt administration. And so Moon Jae-in has taken initiatives. He's still much too subservient to the United States. He still is much too obsequious. He's got to be bolder and take more initiative. And North Korea and South Korea can begin on their own to develop the peace that's been missing otherwise. But I really would like to see the Russians, the Chinese, the South Koreans brought into these discussions. Where they're going to go from here, we don't know. But the chances of some kind of agreement are shrinking. So we have to take a bold step, move outside of the existing limited framework, because it's just too potentially explosive to lose this opportunity. Clearly, Trump is not a great negotiator. Clearly, Trump is not a great deal maker. But I was telling my students last night about the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt and Stalin. And Churchill, the British, did not get along well with Stalin. Churchill said, "I want to strangle Bolshevism in the cradle," back at the time of the Russian Revolution. And he maintained that attitude. Roosevelt came in with a different attitude. First, Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union, which had not been done from 1917 to 1933. Then Roosevelt reached out to Stalin, and he talks about the process of how at Tehran he approached Stalin. He started to make jokes with Stalin about Churchill. They had to be translated, but he warned Churchill before, and Churchill was not going to like what's happening, but Roosevelt went ahead and did it anyway. Because the first couple of days they were there, it was very formal and very icy. And then Roosevelt used his charm in order to break through with Stalin. And then they developed a personal relationship. And he said, by the end of the meeting in Tehran, I was calling him Uncle Joe. And then they could talk, and then they developed a friendship. And had Roosevelt lived longer, then it's very, very likely that the Cold War would not have started. It was Truman's narrowness and blindness and limitations in large part and a misunderstanding that led to the initial bad tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945 after Roosevelt's death. But I was talking to my students that there is something to be said for this kind of personal diplomacy, of building friendly ties, of building trust. And so, of course, it's appalling to see the things that Trump says about Kim Jong-un being a great leader when he is running a police state, and in many ways a horrible, horrible system in North Korea. But on the other hand, if we can achieve peace because of Trump's flattery, then maybe we can tolerate that, hold our nose, vomit, and tolerate this because it's better than war on the Korean Peninsula. But it has to be coupled with diplomacy. It has to be coupled with understandings. We don't even understand we have a different understanding of denuclearization than the North Koreans do. We haven't agreed on basics yet. And the North Koreans have not shown a great willingness to negotiate. The Americans appointed Stephen Biegun to be our lead negotiator, and the North Koreans wouldn't even meet with him. So that's why we need outside pressure. The Chinese, the Russians have got to be putting pressure. The Americans have got to be offering concessions. It's got to be a step-by-step, incremental moving toward an agreement, and continue to make progress so that we're talking instead of threatening. We were in a very, very precarious situation just a little bit more than a year ago. So it's better now than it was then, but where we go from here is crucial, and what role the Chinese and the Russians are going to play, because they really helped bring Kim to the table in the first place. But Trump's relation with both those countries is terrible at this point. The threats toward China, the trade war toward China, the raising of the tariffs, his relation with Russia is also terrible. But so the world needs to step back. And among the things I've been calling for is an international summit. That we've got these little men as leaders of all these different countries. But what we've got to do is sit down and have a serious discussion. We need Trump at the table. We need Putin at the table. We need Xi at the table. We might even need Modi at the table. The situation in India and Pakistan is very troubling at the moment. Bring in Merkel, bring in other leaders, but a handful, a half dozen leaders. One of the things that Roosevelt talked about during World War II, and he proposed this to Molotov when Molotov came to Washington in May of, might have been early June, late May of 1942. He said that after the war, we're going to need 4 policemen who are going to have to stabilize the world. And Roosevelt said they should be the United States, China, the Soviet Union, and Britain. And he said we have to disarm all the other countries, and only 4 countries will maintain weapons, but they'll use that in order to maintain peace and stability in the post-war world. That was Roosevelt's vision. It later broadens, and he has the idea of the United Nations, which is in some ways a more tenable kind of concept. But we need the leaders of the world to be sitting down and dealing with the nuclear threats, dealing with the wars around the planet, dealing with climate change, dealing together with terrorism in a way that makes sense, and economic development, and the gap between the rich and poor. And there are things that we need to be working on together as a species, seeing this as a globe, one planet that we're sharing with limited resources that we're destroying in the process, and that we're threatening with extinction. So, I mean, that's what we need. But again, we can start with the Korean situation. I'd like to see some very, very rapid movements. And I'd like to see Putin and Xi now propose to broaden this discussion. If Trump and hopefully Trump and the North Koreans and the South Koreans will go along with that. The Korean Peninsula is probably the most militarized area in the world. So the United States has got 28,500 troops there. The United States has battleships off the coast of Korea. The Koreans have a massive amount of artillery. The Koreans can wipe out Seoul without using nuclear weapons, the North Koreans. The South Korean army is actually bigger than the North Korean army. So the amount of money that's wasted, the amount of resources, the amount of manpower that's wasted. You look at the situation in North Korea. My Korean colleagues from the from the Korean embassy here in Washington, tell me that the standard of living in South Korea, or the per capita GDP in South Korea, is 43 times as high as in North Korea. The North Koreans are aware of this. Why do they put up with it? Because they've been told, and it's true, that they're under the gun, under the threat of U.S. military attack. So they're willing to sacrifice. They've gone through periods of starvation. But Pyongyang is fairly decent shape. But you go out in the countryside, and the people are miserable. There's also no political freedom of the sort that we'd like to see. So the situation in North Korea is terrible. But in North Korea, there's a constant reminder about the Korean War. And what did the U.S. do during the Korean War? We wiped out all of Korea. In fact, the British Army yearbook for 1951 says that South Korea almost doesn't exist anymore as a country. The United States not only flattened every city in North Korea, it flattened every city in South Korea during that war. People were living in caves. They were eating grass. It was a horrible situation. And the U.S. decides it's going to use it to liberate North Korea. And so they push up. MacArthur was warned by the Chinese that if they got too close to the border, the Chinese are coming in. MacArthur laughed at them. He says, oh, they can't do that. They just had a revolution. It's a bunch of peasants. What could they do? The Chinese did come in. They overwhelmed the American forces. General Bradley says this is the biggest, most embarrassing defeat in American history. They pushed the Americans and the South Koreans all the way back there. And this was with a relative peasant army that, so which the Americans thought could never challenge us. But the memories of the Korean War are kept alive deliberately in North Korea. And so the North Koreans have a sense of being threatened, and they have been threatened, and they understand that the only thing that keeps them in power is that they've got first weapons that can threaten Seoul, and then they've got nuclear weapons. So I don't think they're going to give up their nuclear arsenal. Maybe they would freeze it. Maybe they would stop testing, which would stop them from perfecting their arsenal, stop testing missiles, stop testing bombs. But the overall situation is that that entire area is frightfully militarized, that the U.S. and South Korea conducts war games, sometimes with Japan, in the sea off the coast of Korea. Some of these are decapitation drills that based on the idea that the U.S. would bomb, invade, decapitate the leadership of North Korea, and then seize North Korea's nuclear weapons. Part of why the United States wants, and the North Korea refuses to give this map of what everything North Korea has, is because they don't want to make it easy. They've been burying things, building things underground. We don't know if we could knock out their nuclear facilities, but we do know that the latest tests show they have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can hit the continental United States, and they've got nuclear warheads that are, this last one was far, far more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, and was estimated to be, the North Koreans claim it was actually a hydrogen bomb, not a fission bomb. So they've got tremendous capabilities, but the U.S. could wipe out North Korea. Nobody has any doubt that the U.S. could wipe out North Korea. The question is, what would that mean? How many millions and millions of deaths? If it goes nuclear, how much would the fallout, how much would the effects in the atmosphere spread across the planet? What would happen to China on the border? What would happen to other countries on the North Korean border? I mean, nobody wants to see that. Would the Chinese tolerate an American military presence so close to their border? They certainly have not shown any indication that they would. So denuclearization, we don't know what that means. Does that mean that the U.S. pulls troops out of South Korea? I mean, Trump has said at one point we should pull our troops out of South Korea. Many of us think that would be a good thing if there was a stable peace there. Would that mean the United States stop targeting North Korea? We don't have nuclear weapons in South Korea, but we have them offshore very often. We send those American nuclear subs to that area. The warships, cruisers, destroyers, the fleets. So, yeah, that's the whole situation is very dangerous. We need to step back, but it has to be part of a broader global solution, is what we really need right now. The situation that troubled me the most this week was not U.S. and North Korea, it was India and Pakistan. That situation over Kashmir has been crazy. They went to war in 1965. They went to war in 1971. They almost went to war in 1999. They came even closer in 2001. We have to remember that India first tested a bomb back in 1974, but they didn't actually weaponize. But in 1998, India and Pakistan both tested atomic bombs. They have big arsenals. We estimate that Pakistan has probably 150 nuclear weapons. India has 140 nuclear weapons. And the situation there along the line of control in Kashmir is always tense. They're always shelling each other across there. And so last week, we have a Jaish-e, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Jaish-e Muhammad, Army of Muhammad terrorist group in Kashmir, bombed the Indian troops there and killed 40 troops. That was one of several terrorist incidents. India went crazy. Marches in the street. Modi has already mobilized the Indian nationalists. They're putting out there with signs now, crush Pakistan. They demanded, Modi says, we're going to retaliate. And then he did. And then they bombed inside of Pakistan, not in Kashmir, but went across and bombed inside of Pakistan. Pakistanis are claiming, well, they just hit a field, they didn't do any damage. And then the Pakistanis bomb inside Kashmir, Indian military installations inside Kashmir. The Indians bomb Pakistan again, and a couple of their planes get shot down. Now they've got an Indian prisoner. This is a very dangerous situation. The Indians respond by cutting off water supplies to Kashmir, by cutting off buses into Kashmir. And people in both those countries, rabid nationalists in both those countries. I was just in India last month. And, it's great people there in a potentially wonderful situation, but they hate the Pakistanis. And they obviously have good reason. We have the terrorist attacks that have happened repeatedly, taking over the Indian parliament, killing 166 people in one of these incidents. So we've had, and the thing is that the problem in Pakistan is you've got this new prime minister, Khan, who is a popular hero there. And if you look at what he says, he's saying the right things, and he's reaching out to India. I think there would be some hope for a resolution there. However, the real power in Pakistan doesn't lie with the prime minister. It lies with the army and the intelligence community, the ISI. And they do harbor terrorists, and they do use the terrorists in a military way as an outreach, as an arm of Pakistani foreign policy. And we see that in Afghanistan, we see it in India, we see it in Kashmir. So again, a very volatile situation. And just to make the point, I don't know if we had a chance to talk about this last time, but one of my big fears is the danger of nuclear winter. You should stop me if we talked about this last time. But the experts now say that if there was a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, which 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons were used, that would create partial nuclear winter. The cities would burn, the dust and debris would go up into the atmosphere and the smoke. They would block the sun's rays from coming down to the earth. The temperatures on much of the planet would plunge below freezing. Agriculture would be destroyed, and between 1 and 2 billion people would die in a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. This would be all over the planet, up to 2 billion people. We know that India and Pakistan alone have close to 300 nuclear weapons, and they're much bigger. And we look at it on a global scale, there are 14,000 plus nuclear weapons, most between 7 and 80 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. So that's the insanity of what we've created on this planet. And then we look at the situation in India and Pakistan with these hotheads on both sides. As the former head of the Pakistani army said when they almost went to war in 2001, the general said, well, you can get killed in a nuclear war, you can get killed crossing the street, getting hit by a car. What's the difference? What's the difference is that we have the threat of partial global winter with nuclear war. And the scenario that we assume with this step-by-step incremental escalation is then finally the Indian troops invade Pakistan. They overwhelm the Pakistani army. The Indian army is twice the size of the Pakistani army. And the Pakistanis have one way to respond, nuclear weapons. And the Indians respond. And then both countries are gone. And so is much of humanity. So this is we're living in a world right now that is just too dangerous for us to go on as if the status quo, it can be tolerated. It can't. Yes, and it happened in the 1980s. I mean, the citizens in Germany were appalled when the U.S. put the Pershing missiles and the other missiles into Europe at that point, and the Russians put the SS-20s on their side in East Germany. And this is what the danger of doing away with the INF Treaty is. The possibility of putting those missiles back in Europe, which means we've got a 10 to 12 minute warning time. And we often get false launch messages on missiles being launched. And intercontinental ballistic missiles, at least we get a 30-minute warning time, and we have time to check. If you've got a 10-minute warning time, you've got to respond almost instantaneously, or you think that your country's going to be attacked and your deterrent or your arsenal is going to be wiped out. So that's the danger of Trump's doing away with the INF treaty. And Putin responded in kind. And Putin said, we're going to have a mirror image, which is going to be a symmetrical response. We're going to put weapons right outside of the United States that can hit the United States in that same short period of time, maybe even half the time, 5 minutes. This is not what we need. We don't need tit-for-tat retaliation on both sides. What they're talking about, they're talking about ending life on our planet. So what people have to do is mobilize. In the 1980s, not only in Germany, but the United States, there was an anti-nuclear march in Central Park in New York City in 1982, attended by 1 million people, including a young Barack Obama when he was a student at Columbia. Talking about some of the world's great disappointments, Barack Obama, unfortunately, is one of them, the Barack Obama presidency. Of course, it's not terrible like Trump, it's not terrible like Bush, but it was disappointing because there was so much hope that something good would come out of it rather than maintaining the status quo, which is pretty much what happened. But yeah, people have mobilized. Leading that fight in the 1950s was actually the Indian Prime Minister Nehru, which is why we can appeal to Indians. They've got a history, a tradition. Gandhi, Nehru. Nehru said that American leaders, when the Americans were testing their bombs, he said American leaders are self-centered lunatics who are willing to blow up everybody, anybody who gets in their way. He led the fight for stopping atmospheric nuclear testing. He led the fight for nuclear disarmament in the 50s. He led the Third World Movement in the 50s. I want to see that. That's why I go to places like India. That's why I address rallies of 4,000 people there and go to all these different campuses because we need to awaken people on a global scale. The United Nations passed last year the nuclear ban treaty. It was supported by a lot of countries. Now we need all those countries to sign it. Germany plays a crucial role in all of this. Germany plays a pivotal role. The Germans understand the importance of learning from history. That's what Oliver Stone and I have been stressing. We can't ignore history. We've got to learn from history. What Germany has done in terms of remembering what happened, the Holocaust, the atrocities of Hitler, is exemplary. Japan has not done that. That's why they've got Abe, and the danger is now what's going on in Korea is that the Japanese are going to want to develop nuclear weapons again, or develop nuclear weapons. The Japanese have been more hostile to nuclear weapons than any other country in the world, partly because of their history. They were the target of the 2 nuclear weapons that the U.S. used in World War II. They have a very strong anti-nuclear tradition in history. But a lot of that is changing now with the militarization. The fact that Abe could be such a jerk as to nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, and to do that seriously, that's obscene. The Japanese people should be out in the streets protesting that. But I'd love to see more activism in Germany around the INF Treaty. Maas, the German foreign minister, talked about the importance of maintaining the INF Treaty. The Europeans were very appalled by Trump's tearing up the INF Treaty. They understand how important this is, because the real danger now is that the entire architecture of nuclear controls is going to be demolished. In February of 2021, the New START treaty comes up, it ends, and Putin proposed to Trump that we extend the New START treaty. This is what puts limits on nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Not limits enough, but at least limits. And Trump said, no, it's another bad treaty. He doesn't want to extend that either. He's got people around him like Bolton and Pompeo who hate any constraints upon America's might, American militarism, American weapons. And so these are the ones who are the most dangerous, posing the biggest threat. I'm not sure. I forget what can people in the world do? They've got to educate themselves. Oliver and my documentaries, The Untold History of the United States, are out all over the world. They've played all over the world. 12 hours on the untold history of the United States. But our book is out. Now we've got two books. The big one here is 800 pages, and it's going to be out in a new edition on April 2nd. The one in Germany, unfortunately, is what we call the shorter version. But I wish that Germany, they would republish, or they would translate and publish the big version, which has all of the footnotes, the history, much more extensive. The new version that's coming out is going to be over 900 pages, and it's going to have a chapter that goes from 2012 to 2019. It's going to take it up to the present. So it's going to talk about the rest of Obama. It's going to talk about Bush. It's talking about Trump, and how much more dangerous our world is. The world in 2019 is so much more dangerous than the world was in 2012. People don't appreciate how much worse the world has gotten in that period. And they have some sense of what happened in Ukraine and Crimea and Syria and now Iran. Just how much. They don't understand the extent of how much more dangerous. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock in January 2018 to 2 minutes before midnight. It had last been moved to 2 minutes before midnight in 1953 after the US and the Soviets tested what they thought at the time were hydrogen bombs. The Soviets was a prototype. But then we moved the hands to 2 minutes before midnight. Then it got to 12 minutes before midnight. The world got much safer. Now it's back to 2 minutes before midnight. A plausible case can be made for moving it closer to midnight again, even than that. So, but people have to mobilize. They've got to educate themselves. In the United States, we've got a real problem. The American National Report Card was issued in June 2011, and it found that the area in which American high school seniors tested the lowest was not foreign languages, was not science, was not math. It was U.S. history. 12% of American high school seniors were found to be proficient in U.S. history. Not excellent, not outstanding, not knowledgeable, proficient. But of that 12%, even that was doubtful, because only 2% could explain what the monumental Brown versus Board of Education decision was about, the Supreme Court decision in 1954 about school desegregation was about, even though it was obvious from the way the question was worded. So Americans' understanding of history is non-existent. As Zhou Enlai once said, it's charming how little Americans know of history. Well, it's not charming, it's dangerous, and it's not funny, it's dangerous. I see that all the time because I teach history and I lecture about this. But the same thing, to a lesser extent, exists in other countries. Germany has made it impossible for German students not to learn the history of the Holocaust. In the United States, one of the things that at some point you and I want to talk about is American exceptionalism. Well, in the United States, in 2015, the advanced placement exams and courses put in a new section on American exceptionalism because there were protests all over the country in 2014 by the conservatives and the right-wingers that the textbooks that were used for advanced placement classes on U.S. history were too critical. And they didn't talk about America's greatness again. Well, we need to have a discussion about this notion of American exceptionalism because it's at the root of a lot of the things that are the biggest problems now.